Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Toby Simpson. I'm the director of the Weiner Holocaust Library, and it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening to host our book talk on Frank Trentmann's Out of the Darkness, the Germans 1942 to 2022. This is a joint event between the Weiner Holocaust Library and the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And before we start, I do want to say thank you to the director of BISA, David Feldman, and also to Jan Davidson, who have both played an instrumental role in organising tonight's event. We are delighted to partner with them and would urge you all to look out for future events, either joint events between the Weiner Library and BISA, or indeed BISA's own events programme. For anyone who isn't aware of the Weiner Library, perhaps this is your first time here, the Weiner Library is the world's oldest archive dedicated to the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. It's Britain's largest collection. Our materials range in type over documents, photographs, posters, diaries, letters. We have a very large and diverse archive, most of which is held downstairs. And we also have a free public reading room, which is open to anyone. You don't need to make an appointment. If this is a subject you're interested in, and I suspect it is given the topic of Frank's book, please do visit us and also take advantage of our exhibition and events programme. We are a charity, however, and we would really appreciate your support. So do visit our website where you can give a donation if you feel to do so. It is crucial that we maintain the evidence of the Holocaust, especially today in the context of rising anti-Semitism. So our talk this evening is, of course, about Frank's book, Out of the Darkness, the Germans, 1942 to 2022. And this book is, I think, takes a fascinating perspective on the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st, in the sense of examining German society in terms of the moral crises and moral dilemmas that German citizens faced and how that impacted on the German sense of identity. And you could argue that Germany today is undergoing a new dilemma and crisis, particularly in the wake of the Russian attack on Ukraine, which prompted Chancellor Olaf Scholz to announce a Zeitenwende, an era of change. So it raises all sorts of questions about Germany's place in the world, which have indeed been intensified since Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel on the 7th of October last year. So there will be a contemporary focus in today's talk, and yet also speaking to Frank before the talk, we are also going to touch on the beginning of the book, which is, of course, the Weiner Holocaust Library's focus. Starting in 1942, the commencement of area bombing in Germany, at the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad, the start of Germans in a widespread way asking themselves, in a sense, what have we done? So I'm really fascinated to hear this talk, and I'm just going to say a few words about our speaker. Frank Trentmann is Professor of History at Birkbeck University of London and also at the University of Helsinki. He's the author of a groundbreaking book, The Empire of Things, and also Free Trade Nation. He was a Moore Scholar at Caltech and has been awarded several prizes, including the Whitfield Prize, the Austrian Science Book Prize, the Humboldt Prize for Research, and the 2023 Bochum Historians Prize. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Frank Trentmann. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming to speak to us this evening.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and indeed for the invitation. It's a special pleasure to be here today, and that's not just because it's the shortest walk to any event I had to take, because I'm literally two buildings from the left. But you know, the Weiner Library is such an important public space as well as a research institution that for scholars, modern history, contemporary historians, it is absolutely vital. And so is the public work that's being done by the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And I'd like to thank both institutions and the directors and indeed the volunteers who are helping with this event. Now, what I like to do really with this talk is to use this history, which looks at 80 years of the lives of Germans from the middle of the Second World War to the Russian attack on Ukraine, to shed some light on the present. And so basically, I'm asking two questions. I want to explore two questions. One is, how did the Germans become who they are today? How effectively, how does a society evolve from being supporters of Hitler to the society they are today? And then secondly, I want to ask what the legacy of some of the moral dilemmas and challenges, the successes, but also the limitations are for how Germany stands today in the world. Now, in the book, I tell this story as one which leads to ever deeper moralization of life. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that by the end of the book, so basically where we are today, there's hardly a topic, social or political or cultural topic in Germany, which is not very quickly moralized when people are having a debate. How do I know this? Well, when I started working on the book, we were in autumn 2015, the so-called refugee crisis, where under then Chancellor Angela Merkel, almost 1 million refugees were entering Germany by the end of the year. And in autumn 2015, you had, for example, a Green member of parliament in parliament announcing how Germans can be proud now that they're world champions of human compassion. At the same time, you have talk about Germany being a peace power. Germans are the drivers of the so-called Energiewende, which supposedly leads the world to a sustainable future. They always save and never supposedly run into debts. That's what the Greeks do. And so once you start scratching, you realize economic, political, social topics are quickly moralized. So I started being interested in where does this come from? The initial hunch, which I think is probably the dominant view in a lot of German media, is you don't need to write a book. You just need to say 1968. The idea that a new young generation of Germans suddenly confronted the crimes of their fathers. They realized, particularly in West Germany, how lucky they were. They got off the hook for awful war crimes and the Holocaust, and instead were allowed to have an economic miracle, join the West, be democratic, and have a carefree life. And so deep down in the subconscious in this argument, people felt shame and needed to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they had overcome all the past failings. And so after 1968, in that argument, morality becomes a way to show the world we are good people again. That looks sort of attractive if you first hear it. The problem with it is that the moral reorientation and the energy released by struggles over questions like fairness, solidarity, but also reparations, of course, starts well before 1968. So 68 is really pretty much a chapter in an ongoing story. And I would argue that while it's not unimportant, 1968 in Germany, it's pretty much running in a half-open door that had already been opened by civil society groups active in the 1950s. So what I want to do today is look at some of these historical dynamics that produce this moral energy, the dilemmas and the contradictions arising from it, and then locate the present. And so I want to start where the book starts in the winter of 1942-43, and then look at some particular themes, peace, versus military values. And then I want to look at Germans' difficulties with strangers, other types of lifestyles, which will also bring me to the topic of anti-Semitism. And then I want to say a few words about East and West, because of course, for half the time in this book, Germany was divided into a democratic West and into a socialist East. Now, why does the book start in the winter of 1942-43 rather than in 1945, the so-called Hour Zero? And there are really two reasons for that. The first is that the people I'm dealing with who are emerging from the Second World War did not come with a clean slate in 1945. They both brought to the post-war world the crimes they had committed, as well as the pain they themselves had suffered. And they didn't just strip that off at the moment of defeat. But more importantly, as I was sort of working in the archives, it became clear that certain questions, uncertainties, dilemmas had already been posed in 1943 and 1944, so that people were already, as the war, not everyone, but a growing number of people were already asking themselves moral questions about their own role in the war that are important to consider if we want to understand how a society regrouped itself and remade their identities. And so I just want to read one short passage from 1943 and 1944 to give you a little bit of sense of what this emerging soul searching sounded like. And so I start in spring of 1943, so a few months after the defeat at Stalingrad, and as aerial bombings is intensifying on German cities. And we're in Halle, which is in the Prussian province of Saxony, where opinion was split about what to do. Between what I'm going to read to you all comes from notes recorded by the security service of what local voices were saying in different towns and communities. So in Halle, public opinion was split between those who wanted to kill the Jews and those who said that if the Germans had not attacked the Jews in the first place, they would already be enjoying peace. The shock of Stalingrad has still not faded away. The district president of Swabia in the south observed in June 1943, and there were fears Russians might kill German prisoners of war in revenge for German mass executions of Jews in the East, quote. By 1944, the security branch in Stuttgart criticized Nazi propaganda about the Red Army massacre of German civilians in Nemmersdorf, which is now in Lithuania, the first village in East Prussia to fall to the Soviets because it so easily backfired. Numerous voices in the population were saying, every thinking person who sees the blood sacrifice will immediately think of the atrocities that we have committed in enemy lands, indeed, even in Germany itself. Have we not slaughtered the Jews in their thousands? Do soldiers not report again and again that Jews in Poland had to dig their own graves? And what we have done to the Jews in Alsace, in the concentration camps? Jews are human too. Thus, we have shown the enemies how they can treat us if they win. That was a lot of we's. The sense of complicity for crimes committed in their name was now spreading among those on the home front. So these are the voices. So, several things to note. One is just how openly people talked about, some groups talked about complicity and how much knowledge was circulating. That knowledge was not yet framed as the Holocaust, as we call it today, but clearly plenty of talk about mass executions and other crimes. So what's going on here? Well, effectively, after Stalingrad, German society is increasingly in a moral pressure cooker, and we're seeing extremes of opinions. On the one side, there are people now saying, well, of course we're being bombed. We started it. Now we're being punished. We shouldn't really have done what we did when the deportations were happening, or we should have kept some of the Jews in our town. So that's sort of one view. On the other hand, you have the polar opposite view, which is the kill the Jews quote in what I just read, where people are saying, well, actually, Goebbels and Hitler's, they're right. The Bolshevik Jews American conspiracy is trying to eliminate all Germans. So we must now really be absolutely ruthless and kill the last few remaining Jews. So those are the two polar opposites. The churches are in the middle. They're saying, yes, we're guilty, and that's why we're being bombed. But the guilt is otherworldly. It's because we haven't been Christian enough. We haven't gone to church enough. We haven't prayed enough. So it's a relationship between the individual and God rather in this world. But what you have in this moral pressure cooker is a growing number of people asking themselves for the first time uncomfortable questions of what might happen if Germany does not win the war. Now, the war isn't lost in 1943, but for the first time, there are voices who are saying, well, we may not win the war. And if we don't win the war, we may have to face up to what we've done. I have some jokes. Germans do jokes, but they're on the dark side in this book. And one joke from spring 1943 is recorded by a school teacher who said, well, the neighbor just told my wife a new joke. Do you know the shortest joke? Wir siegen, we are winning. This is spring 1943. The same teacher does not know whether his son is still alive in captivity or killed in Stalingrad. And it produces long entries suddenly in his diary where he's asking himself all sorts of uncomfortable questions, such as, the leaders of this world are really evil, but who's the more evil one? Who's the source of evil? Is it Stalin, as we're told, or is it perhaps Hitler, after all? This is a man who in 40, 41, 42 is cheering on Hitler as the greatest military leader and statesman the world has ever seen. He's so proud of his colleagues who are young enough to fight in the war. But then Stalingrad happens and he doesn't know the fate of his son. And he suddenly thinks to himself, well, are we actually, what is this war about? Why are wonderful German sons and brothers like my own being sacrificed? Sacrificed for what? Is it a just war? What actually are the war aims? Things that hadn't appeared in the diary beforehand. This is a teacher who starts in 41, 42 to write confidential reports on what neighbors, school teachers, pupils are saying in his town, Oldenburg and in Lower Saxony, after Stalingrad. Within half a year, he decides, well, he's not going to wear the party sticker, the party button any longer. He will not hoist the swastika flag until his son is safely back home. And he stops writing confidential reports to the security service. By 44, early 45, the same person who's cheered on German troops has convinced himself that actually he never really was a supporter of Nazi Germany. He always had doubts about the whole project. And I think while he's not representative of all Germans, there's a growing number of people like that. And it's important to understand that, because it helps us understand the transition after 45 to a different society. Here were people who had rearranged their biography and their identity to accommodate themselves to new realities. And in the course of that, they'd also rearranged their own past. So there are important tensions already going on in 43 and 44, which I think are very, very important to understand. Now, one big challenge after the Second World War is about the future or nature of the army and military life. So in the early 50s, the question of rearmament almost tears West Germany apart. You have the biggest demonstrations in history in many cities against rearmament. You have attempts by various cities to have plebiscites to derail Adenauer's policy to introduce a new army. But the new army is introduced in West Germany and then also in East Germany. And that means you have a debate, what kind of army will this new army be? And you have rival factions in the Bundeswehr, in the West German army, about what it means to be a soldier in democratic society. And alongside, you have a growing peace movement. So already before the Easter marches, but then in the Easter marches in the early 60s, and then on into the 70s and 80s with mass demonstrations and blockades of nuclear weapons, where peacefulness is now identified as a core German value. And these tensions, I think, are important to understand if you want to understand why Germany was so conflicted and remains very conflicted about the appropriate policy towards Ukraine in the current war. So I'm just going to read you voices from the two sides. The first one is from 1983 and comes from a place called Mutlangen, which is near Stuttgart, sort of southwest, where NATO tries to station nuclear rocket heads. And several thousand people gather outside the barracks to blockade the entry of military vehicles. The police comes for several days, including Heinrich Böll, a Nobel Prize winner of literature, and many other luminaries, as well as ordinary people. They're having sort of a sit-down blockade. They're being removed by police and have to go to trial. They're being charged. And the trials are an opportunity for these protesters to give their view of why they were involved in civil disobedience. And these are not just 68ers or young people, they also involve members of the older generation, such as a woman called Meta Lamberts, who was born in 1936. So we're 1984 when the trial happens. And she describes to the judge how peace was really a learning process for her and came fairly late in life. She explains that she belonged to an older generation of teachers for whom it was natural to resort to the occasional slap in the face of pupils when she was teaching. I am an apolitical person who tends to trust blindly in authority, she said. But then it was the declaration of the Council of Churches in 1981 and the arms race that woke her up. She felt she needed to do something, especially in light of people's complicity in the Nazi era. So she joined boycotts against South African products, But then she realized that as a taxpayer, she was implicated personally in the arms buildup. I cannot leave these things to the politicians. I must involve myself, she explained. And so she began taking 5 marks and 72 pfennigs off her automobile tax, 1 penny per Pershing 2 or cruise missile. You have a sort of small movement that which you know, the judges and lawyers just think this is misunderstanding how taxes work, but it's very important for them. But you see here this idea, this is not something external, politicians, ministers, civil servants, generals, but actually as a citizen, you are implicated. And that becomes a problem because the past, Nazi Germany, is now seen in terms of complicity. So not just a few bad Nazis and other Germans who couldn't do anything, but German society is now seen as having been complicit, and that has lessons for the present. So that's the peace people. And we have a lot, I mean, we have a very rich literature. And if you look at sort of survey text on post-war Germany, it can look like everyone joins the peace movement, everyone's on an Easter march, all Germans are on the barricades in '68, everyone's progressive and liberal, and things become ever better. And what that misses out is the fact that actually the largest number of young men do military service. It's a small minority that become conscientious objectors, and they have written about that. But it raises the question, well, what does war and peace mean for the millions of people who do compulsory military service? And just as it happens, in the military archive, the Federal Archive with military sources in Freiburg, you have a large cache of essays written by sergeants, young sergeants in the early 60s, who had to go to seminars and then write essays on questions such as, what is a good soldier? Or, what's your view about Stauffenberg's attempt to assassinate Hitler on the 20th July 1944? Or, tell us about your favorite book and what you like about it. Things like that. And so we have essays from these soldiers which give us an insight in just how varied attitudes to war and peace remain by the early 60s. So one soldier said, well, Hitler might have waged an unjust war, but the soldiers' values lived on: courage, obedience, loyalty, a sense of duty and camaraderie. Others said that in the Second World War, soldiers' actions had been clean, and all Germans now, including conscientious objectors, should feel great pride in how German soldiers had resisted the large enemy so courageously. One Bundeswehr soldier's favorite book was a war novel about a group of fighter pilots. What he liked about it, he explained, was that the men knew that they were serving a cause which was condemned to fail, but nonetheless kept fighting to the end. Their sense of honor and shame gave them composure, Haltung is the German word, and made them the inner victors. A very common trope. The idea is, Germany might have lost the war, but German soldier was the inner victor because they fought on. The tough, selfless soldier was needed more than ever to halt the avalanche from the east. The middle classes, another said, were too well fed, degenerate, remote controlled by various interests. Classic anti-Semitic trope. You have people, I could go on, you have people writing their own poems on how heroic German soldiers were. One lieutenant wrote on the question of war crimes and human rights conventions. He said, well, In battle, this is 1962, in battle, his first obligation is to his men and his troops. If some people from some village fired at them, of course they go in and root out the whole village. There is no such thing, he said, as law at a time of war. So you have, interestingly, within the army itself, you have this battle over what is it to be a virtuous soldier. This stretches from people who want to reform the army, who are talking about citizens in uniform, who are stressing that a criminal order needs to be resisted by soldiers on the one hand, and then you have generals who really think these democratic reforms are undermining the fighting spirit of an army and are trying to resist. And it's only under Helmut Schmidt in the early mid-70s that this is resolved towards the democratic side. In the East, in East Germany, the situation is much, much simpler because not only do you have the Nationale Volksarmee and compulsory service, but the state views battle as a natural attribute of what a good socialist citizen should be doing. And hence children are taught how to lob hand grenades and have endurance marches and things like that. So military spirit and aggression is much more widespread in East Germany, which, as a small footnote, raises actually interesting question on why so many people today in East Germany are so fearful of war, because literally for 30 years, the overwhelming spirit was militaristic. Now let me turn to the relationship between Germans and others. And by that I mean both strangers, but also migrants and people of other faiths and ideas within society. In 1957, in the city of Offenburg, in a pub, a man called Sint, who had far too many drinks, I mean, something like, 5 whiskeys and 6 pints of beer and half a bottle of wine, so heavily drunk, walks over to a table where a, in quotes, half-Jewish camp survivor is sitting, this is 1957, and tells him in a loud voice that Jews were to blame for the collapse of Weimar. And it's a sad thing that this man didn't also go up and smoke. Drunk, goes home. Some people in present mention this. He's a school teacher, which means he's a civil servant. School teachers are civil servants. Some parents in the school ask for conversation to clarify the situation. School director doesn't do much. Some people really concerned then go up to the next level in the bureaucracy and talk to the regional ministry involved. Nothing much happens. Sint continues to teach, and it's then newspapers which learn of this story and publicize what was going on, what was being said in this public space in an inn in 1947. And it's then that the situation explodes. People in Offenburg feel they're being put under sort of national and international scrutiny, as if Offenburg is a sort of haven for anti-Semitic people. And it's only then, when this really reaches French and British newspapers, that action is being taken and Sint is removed. But he's allowed to slip away and then actually starts teaching, I think in Libya, until his death. But it raises the question, which at that point was very embarrassing for many Germans and continues to be, how much anti-Semitic prejudice and activism actually survived. After the attack by Hamas after 7th of October, there was widespread silence in society, and it needed a few weeks for politicians to speak up about what was happening, as within Germany you had anti-Semitic attacks. And the main word that German politicians, including Chancellor Scholz, used was, we should be ashamed that this shouldn't be happening in Germany. And I remember when this happened, I, as a historian, thought, well, yes, of course you should be ashamed, but actually, this is the same speech pattern every single chancellor since Adenauer has been using since the 50s. We have renewed anti-Semitic attacks, and then politicians say, well, we should be ashamed. This is impossible. This can't be happening, shouldn't be happening in Germany. But of course it is happening. The interesting thing is how much within the West German narrative of their own country, with the attention given to memorial culture, remembrance, reckoning with the past, that has been conflated with, well, anti-Semitism must be declining because of it, as if one necessarily leads to another. And in that success story, many stages of anti-Semitic violence were either forgotten or marginalized, such as what happened in 1980, when a group of fascists murdered the publisher Shlomo Levin, and his friend, just went to his villa and shot them. You have a whole series of anti-Semitic attacks that follow. So in many ways, what we've seen since October, yes, there has been a rise if you look at the numbers, but in spirit, really, there's a long history. And the thing to note is that in spite of reparations and memorial culture, anti-Semitism never really went away, either in West or in East Germany. Just to give you a few figures on just how widespread it is, in 2020, 1/4 of West Germans surveyed and 1/3 of East Germans agreed with the statement, the Jews have something peculiar about them and do not quite fit in with us. In a West German school in northern part of Germany, Nordenham, these are 15, 16-year-olds, 1 in 8 students said that Jews have too much influence in the world. If you look at voters for the populist right-wing Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, it's actually over 50% who agree with that statement. This is, this is sort of 2020, 2021 data, and 1 in 7 pupils also agree with the statement that Hitler and the Nazis had their good sides, in quotes. So I think, the minute you recognize that memory and memory politics, particularly once it becomes ritualized in annual speeches or ceremonies, is one thing, but action is another. It's actually possible to explain this disjuncture. So memory of something that happened in the past does not automatically translate into action here and now. And the reason for that is that throughout this whole period, we see a tug of war between initiatives trying to cultivate, we would now say, empathy, so a spirit of compassion, the facility of putting yourself into the shoes of another person, someone you may never have met. So you see big initiatives in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s over world hunger, third world politics, also questions on asylum and the treatment of refugees. So to give one example, mid-1950s, you have schools, many schools in Munich, collecting money and making handicraft little soap bags and things like that to send to children in poor areas in Egypt. So you have that. It's accompanied by school texts and also short films and other information to try and make these Munich school children understand what it must be like to live in Egypt in a poor area. So you have that, but at the same time, you have schools, other schools in Munich, where both directors and teachers and parents are firmly convinced, no, this is a waste of time. We should think about us first, us Germans, the poor people in our midst, perhaps, and if we need to, the people fleeing East Germany, looking for a new life in West Germany. So you have this tug of war that's ongoing, and you see it in debates over the treatment of so-called guest workers in the West or contract workers in the East throughout the 70s and 80s. So I don't think it should be that surprising. Let me turn to East and West. One question, of course, I asked myself throughout this book, because I go through the so-called three Germanys. So I have Nazi Germany, I have East and West, and then I have reunified Germany, is to what extent the German Democratic Republic in its 40 years managed to produce a different kind of morality. Did a socialist regime and living under socialism produce different norms and different forms of moral action? Walter Ulbricht, the head of state, of that state, in the 60s, went so far that he produced the 10 socialist commandments. So Bible and churches are out. Socialism needs its own commandments, which he proclaimed and distributed, and they were basically asking people to put their own individual self-interest always, make that always subordinate to collective sacrifice for socialist solidarity within East Germany, but also to support socialist freedom movements, freedom fighters in the rest of the world. And the idea was that people needed to learn to put their own so-called petty bourgeois materialist interests by the side and realize that the collective interest matters much more. So how much of that did they manage to produce? We have a number of different sources which we can investigate for that purpose. One very, very big one are the so-called petitions. The GDR gave citizens the right to send their complaints or suggestions to both socialist companies, organizations, but also to the government and to the ruling party itself. And so by the early mid-1980s, that means several 100,000 people writing what really annoys them and what they think should be done to Honecker and the various other ministers. So we have a fairly good sense of what's considered right and wrong by citizens and how they try to communicate that. And I just pick out one petition, which comes from a worker who is a volunteer on a so-called conflict commission. Since socialism resolves conflict between people, the GDR had so-called conflict commissions where neighbors or parties who were in some dispute or conflict would meet so that the volunteers on the commission could persuade them to put their own particular egotistical interest to the side and come to some understanding. So it wouldn't go to the courts and need more serious action. And so this man had been, he thought, a good socialist citizen doing his bit. But then in 1977, he gets a note in his postbox saying, a parcel was sent to you from West Germany and we've confiscated it. from the Stasi, from the intelligence service. And he asked himself, well, what could that be? So he asked, why did you take my parcel away? And he gets the answer, well, your parcel had 2 items which were fascist in nature. The first one was a beach ball with a Western logo, something like Nivea or so. And the second was a photo album from the recent Olympics in 1976, where the GDR just took all the gold medals, really. But it had an introduction by a West German sports journalist. And he's at a loss. And he goes to his factory and he talks to all his comrades and says, well, we don't understand it. I mean, it's not that we had sort of militaristic literature or Mein Kampf by Hitler or something like that. This is a beach ball and pictures of athletes at the Olympics. And he just at the end decides, no, look, I can't, this doesn't make sense to me. I can't just, if I don't have rights, he concludes, I don't want to have any duties either. And that's it. This is 1977. He just draws a line and basically leads a private life without engagement with the Socialist Party. That's one example. Teenagers, as we all know, are fascinating individuals, and so they are in East Germany as well. In 1985 in Magdeburg, so we have 4 years before the fall of the wall. No one knows the wall is falling. There's one school class of 15-year-olds. So these are the children of Honecker who are sitting in a classroom waiting for their teacher, but the teacher is ill. So they get a new substitute teacher who arrives in class, hasn't had any time to prepare, and has the idea, okay, you're going to write an essay. And the question is, imagine what will the future be like in 30 years from now? And so they all spend an hour writing their essays, except one pupil who's a punk who says, I don't do anything. But everyone else writes this essay, and we have these essays from 1985. And except for one pupil who gives kind of standard slogans about socialist peace and how it will make the future better, the world a better place, all the other children's are flying around to New York, are shopping in Paris, having a villa. The husband always has a Mercedes. The women, interestingly, in spite of what we're always told about gender equality, all the women either are at home with 2 children and a dog, or they're secretaries in an anteroom to their husband's big office, or they become hairdresser. So, but basically, this is a shopping, holiday, skiing fantasy. And it really raises the question of how different these children really are from the ones who were going to school west of the Elbe in capitalist West Germany. So the short is, GDR started out with tremendous socialist ambition. And in the early 50s, there was a certain utopian enthusiasm that made it attract considerable support. But certainly after the wall was built in the early 60s, and then under Honecker, most of those moral ideals are being sold out and discredited. Let me see whether, yes, I think you need to hear from Katja Kramer. Just my last short passage of text to take us into the fall of the wall and reunification. A colleague in Potsdam, at the moment you had mass demonstrations calling for calling for reform, which ultimately led to the fall of the wall and then a year later to reunification. A colleague in Potsdam had the ingenious idea of selecting citizens, East German citizens, to start writing a diary during this period. So we can follow how, this is mainly women, how these women experienced the time from autumn 1989 to reunification and immediately after. And these diaries are collected and give us a kind of snapshot of the moral and personal upheaval people went through. And so my last extract is from one of them, Katja Kramer, who was 36 when her country, where she had grown up, disappeared. And in many ways, she was a model of the professional woman in the GDR. She was a single mother. She was a trained engineer. And in 1987, she was promoted to join a group working on computer technology, which looked really great in 1987. But by 1990, a chip produced by an East German factory has no chance in the world market compared to what's being produced in the West. So she is being told by her bosses that job cuts are probably around the corner. And so in September 1990, she's sitting at an unemployment office, out of work and humiliated. And in her diary, she records the new reality that devalued everything she had accomplished in her life. The forms she had to fill in at the unemployment office were based on a West German lifestyle. For instance, she was asked whether she had attended a gymnasium. That's a selective type of school which didn't exist in East Germany. And quote, whether I had studied outside the Federal Republic. Now, why she did grow up there. She writes, they want to extinguish us completely. I attended a polytechnic secondary school, POS, and an extended secondary school, EOS, in the GDR. And I see no reason to hide that. I'm proud of it. Why do they refuse to recognize that? It makes me want to throw up. In a few months, the joy of November, so the fall of the wall, and the feeling of community and confidence had given way to a sense, she writes, of anger and powerlessness. 1990 for her was a nosedive that ended with the haggling for our souls. The 2nd of October, the last day of the GDR, was, she writes, one of the blackest days of my life. She felt like a convict awaiting execution, expelled, a stranger in my own country, unspeakably sad. No work, no love, no Heimat, homeland, no happiness. Just before midnight, she put on the national anthem to thank her fatherland for all that was good and beautiful in the last 36 years. It is like a funeral, she wrote. So it gives you a sense of this tremendous enthusiasm when we are the people and the fall of the wall, and then how quickly, with the currency union, unemployment, challenges to your identity and lifestyle start to raise a question where this is going. And in many ways, this harsh experience of the 1990s has really left a very, very long emotional and psychological shadow on the present. So it doesn't matter if you look for economic data, the life chances, health, longevity, income patterns, employment patterns, all these things have actually converged. But if you ask people about their identity, whether they think they're being accepted or not, it seems as the two sides have diverged further and further. And so we have an excellent set of interviews and surveys from a youth research center in Leipzig, which has been asking young Germans always the same question since 1989. The question is, how long do you think will it take for the two parts to really come together, sort of hearts and minds? And in 1989, 1990, it said, 5 years. And then by 1995, it became 10 years. 2000 became 20 years. And we're currently at, the expectation is 30 years, even though there has been material convergence. So let me just end by pointing out a few direct, I think, implications for where we are today. The director already mentioned Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, pronouncing a Zeitenwende and sort of an era of change in February 1922. But the question is, how much has Wende, it means turning, how much actually has Germany turned? And how much is it capable of turning? And I would probably briefly emphasize 4 very deep divides that are running through the country, and each of these divides is basically a tension between moral ideas accumulated through the past and real world challenges that have emerged in the last few years. The first one is economic. That's the so-called debt break. Germans thought it was very clever to specify a ceiling of limiting the amount of debt you can add every year into the constitution. That's become literally a corset in a recession that the country is going through, because you can't spend your way out, because that would mean taking on debt. So that's a serious tight corset, and it exists because debt is evil. Saving is good, debt is evil. Only profligate Mediterraneans go in debt, and British people who spend on their credit cards. I mean, that's the popular narrative. So virtuous behavior means no debt. The German saying is, man macht keine Schulden. And that's being applied to public policy. That's a serious problem. The second is Germany and the world, and that relates not just to Ukraine, but also to China. In the decades after the Second World War, Germans got into the habit of eating their cake and wanting their cake and eating it too. And that was possible because responsibility and spending and resources were outsourced, mainly to the United States. Ukraine raises serious problems with regard to that, because Ukraine is dependent on military support, and it will be a big question, I think, if Trump wins the election, whether Germany or Europe alone can step up what they're doing currently. China is particularly interesting from a moral point of view, because you have, on the one hand, a foreign policy and a foreign secretary who speaks very openly about the need to adhere to human rights and stand up to human rights. But at the same time, of course, in the last few years, you've seen more and more German investment in China. And not all that investment is in places or for products which entirely satisfy human rights standards. So you have a direct conflict of this interest. And the third, and probably for us here today, one of the most interesting conflicts and tensions is that between a public and official memory culture and opinions within society over the current conflict in the Middle East. You would all have come across in British media the term Staatsräson is the official German term, so reason of state, literally, that the defense of Israel is an essential part of German policy, and ministers and all parties have vehemently supported that view. The problem with that view is that the defense of Israel is often equated with the defense of anything an Israeli government or an Israeli or the Israeli army does. And the problem with that is that within society, you have a growing dissent with that official position. And it comes from different quarters. One is the argument that this narrow definition marginalizes or blocks out attention to other human rights violations. That's of one position. And one hears a lot about that because that's connected to whether demonstrations are allowed or what's being said at the Berlinale film festival or things like that. Just as important, I think, is to point out that the largest group, according to surveys, the largest group of Germans take a different conclusion from the current conflict. Their conclusion is, yes, perhaps, yes, they would say Germans have a special responsibility, historic responsibility that arises from the crimes committed in the Second World War and the Holocaust. But this significant group takes the conclusion that that means you should stay out of any conflict whatsoever. So their argument is the German government actually is moving in the wrong direction. Their view is what Germany should be doing, it should just retreat. It should just care about its own domestic problems and leave the problems of the world to anyone who wants to have a problem. So and you get then lines, well, Middle East is always a problem, there's always conflict and war. What has it got to do with us, Germans? I think that's a very significant opinion. And together, the critics who feel that the suffering of the Palestinians is ignored by the German government, and the people who are far more numerous who say Germany should just completely stay out of the Middle East, that will create, I think, problems for any government, German government, as the war continues, and will undermine the credibility of the German government, not just internationally, but I think also domestically. The very last point is East and West, which is connected to what I just said, because there has now been a tendency with the continued strength of the populist right, the Alternative for Germany, for many Germans to turn inwards again. Focusing on what they see as the most pressing problems, which is what will happen in the former East. Will the populist party win a majority? How are we going to tackle this? Should we take constitutional or legal steps? Should one talk to these populists or should one exclude them? And my point is not so much that one strategy is better than the other, but a slightly larger point, which is what we're currently seeing is a potentially dangerous mode, which we've seen repeatedly in the post-war decades, where Germans turn inward as if the rest of the world and the problems of the world do not concern themselves, and they should primarily focus on domestic issues. And I think that would be a serious problem, not just for Germany, but for Europe and also the world. Stop here. Thank you.